The arch test is our first active assessment, and it looks at a client's ability to maintain and generate extension of the spine. The counterpart of this test is the hollow test, which assesses the ability to maintain and generate flexion of the spine. When combined, these two skills create midline stability. Without that midline stability, the limbs will struggle to generate leverage and cause a drop in performance. During the arch test, we'll be looking to answer at least 4 questions. Is there enough strength to maintain the arch position? Is there enough strength and coordination to create the arch position from the floor? Is that arch position constant or do they struggle? And is there any pain? There's also 5 secondary questions we need to answer if the client fails a portion of the test. Is there a consistent contraction of the glutes? Are the scapulae drawn downward or shrugged up toward the ears? Are the scapulae's position consistent? Are the knees at full extension? And are the toes pointed away from the body? You won't need any equipment for this test, but you will need a flat surface with enough space for the client to lie down with their arms and legs extended and for you to move around them. Let's have a look at the test. The arch test is broken down into 2 phases. The first is self-assisted, and it looks at strength. They'll help themselves to create the correct position, and their job is just to hold there for 3 seconds. The second phase is self-generated. Instead of easing them into the position, now they need to generate the arch from the floor and hold it for 3 seconds. First up is the self-assisted phase. Joe's lying prone on the floor with his legs together and his arms in the push-up position. That means the palms should be flat with the index fingers pointing straight ahead. The hands should be just behind the shoulders with the elbows tucked alongside the body. From there, he's going to empty his lungs, keep his midline relaxed, and extend the arms like a push-up. He'll keep extending the arms until his belly button's about to come off the ground. Now that we've got his spine into the arch position, we want to see if he has the strength to maintain it. To do that, he's going to get tight in the torso, glutes, and legs, and slowly lift his hands off the ground. Now he's in the arch position and his 3-second hold begins. During that 3-second hold, I'm answering the first and third questions of the test. Is there enough strength to maintain the arch? And is that arch position constant or does he struggle? For the first question, I'm looking for change in the arch position. Is there a partial or complete loss of spinal extension? Dropping the chest or shoulders is an indication that the position's been lost. Do the knees remain extended? Shortening the legs by flexing the knees will diminish the load placed on the torso, making it easier to maintain the arch position. The knees must remain extended in order to pass the test. The other question is how he maintains the arch position. Is it held consistently or is he struggling? I want to see consistency. Shuddering or shaking isn't an indication of failure, but it does demonstrate a lack of coordination, a lack of strength, or both. Assuming the position's held for 3 seconds without compromise, it's time for phase 2. If he lost position within those 3 seconds, I'd begin addressing the secondary questions I mentioned earlier and see if I could coach him to pass. However, if, after some coaching, he still failed the self-assisted phase of the test, there's no point progressing to the more difficult self-generated assessment. Instead, I'd mark down did not finish for both assessments and move on to the hollow test. But for now, let's assume he's passed and we'll circle back to those secondary questions later. Phase 2, the self-generated arch. We looked at whether Joe has the strength to maintain a position of spinal extension. Now we'll see if he also has the coordination to generate that position without using his arms for assistance. To do that, we're going to start on the floor in the same push-up position. I'll get Joe to tighten up his shoulders, torso, glutes and legs and cue him to pull into the arch position. Once he's created as much extension as possible and his arms and legs are off the ground, I'll begin counting off his 3 seconds. During that 3-second hold, I'm answering the second and third questions of the test. Is there enough strength and coordination to create the arch position from the floor? And again, is that position constant or does he struggle? First, I'm looking at whether he can get into the position at all. The spine should be extended, the arms and legs off the ground, and the knees extended as well. Then I'm looking for any loss of that position. Does he drop the chest or shoulders? Does he bend the knees or drop the legs? Lastly, I'm looking at how he performs. Is he consistent or is he visibly struggling? Again, consistency is the aim. Shaking or shuddering isn't failure, but it demonstrates a lack of coordination, strength, or both that need to be addressed in his training program. So what does it mean if Joe passes the self-assisted test but fails the self-generated test? The first test is looking at whether Joe has the strength to resist flexion of the spine under stress. The second test looks at whether he has the coordination to extend the spine and resist flexion under stress. Failing the second test can be seen as possessing the strength but lacking the coordination. That inability to create and maintain extension will show up particularly in movements that involve resisting flexion of the spine, like the deadlift, front squat, and overhead press. Now that we've covered both versions of the arch test, I'm going to circle back to those secondary questions I mentioned earlier. The secondary questions are focused on faults that make the arch position more difficult than it should be. The aim is to identify those faults, rectify them, and turn a fail into a pass. Let's start with the hips and shoulders and the three questions that deal with them. Is there a consistent contraction of the glutes? Are the scapulae drawn downward or shrugged up toward the ears? And are the scapulae's position consistent during the hold? The hips and shoulders are the interface between the limbs and the torso. Any failure within those interfaces will destabilize the limbs and increase stress on the torso. The glutes not only stabilize the base of the spine, but the thighs. If you see your client's thighs shuddering up and down during the arch, ask them to squeeze their butt as hard as they can during the test. If that doesn't work, palpate the glutes to see if they're contracting consistently. If they're not, make a note of it and address it in their training program. Next is the shoulders, which will break down further into two problems. Are the scapulae drawn downward or shrugged up towards the ears? And are the scapulae's position consistent during the hold? The lesser of these two problems is consistently shrugged shoulders. This destabilizes the shoulder girdle, making it more difficult to maintain thoracic extension and to stabilize the arms. However, because it's consistent, the arms are less likely to move around and increase stress on the torso. The worst of the two is inconsistent scapular position. This keeps all the problems that come with shrugged shoulders, but compounds them by robbing the arms of a consistent anchor point, increasing stress on the torso. In both cases, try to coach them to keep both shoulders drawn down towards the hips. If they can't, address it in their training program. Lastly, are the knees extended and are the toes pointed away from the body? For the knees, we're not looking at whether they're flexed, as that would simply be a failure to maintain the correct position. What we're looking for is repeated flexion and extension throughout the hold. Flexing the knees effectively shortens the legs and decreases the amount of leverage they place on the hips and torso. Extending them does the opposite. Therefore, repeated flexion and extension of the knees constantly changes the load placed on the torso, and it's difficult for the torso to provide stability while adapting to a load that changes constantly. The solution to this fault is simply keeping the knees extended, though that can be easier said than done. Of course, this fault could also be the product of inconsistent contraction of the glutes, so be sure to address the question on glute contraction first, then see if you've still got a problem with the knees. Finally, are the toes pointed away from the body throughout the hold? This simple act makes it easier to keep the knees extended and the glutes contracted, so keep this idea up your sleeve as you address any faults in their position. As you're moving through these secondary questions, be mindful of time, as there are still more tests to conduct, and this is a screening, not a PT session. If you are tight on time, don't be afraid to cut your losses and move to the next test. Just be sure to make a note of their failure, use the secondary questions to identify potential causes, and address them in your programming. Lastly, ask whether they experienced any pain during the movement and mark the answer on the screening performer. Before we move on, here's a few key points to keep in mind during the arch test. First, the client's doing all the work, so before you start testing them, they'll need a demonstration of the movement. Once you've demonstrated the movement, coach them through it a couple of times. Second, during the self-assisted arch, ensure the torso remains relaxed during the setup and the movement is driven by the arms, and don't let that belly button come off the ground. Lastly, empty the lungs before extending and contracting the torso. If the client starts with full lungs and takes a breath during the test, their torso will contract around that empty space and change their position. Instead, empty the lungs, then get tight, then breathe into that compressed space. The data you've collected in this test can be compared to the hollow test, the squats test, the glute function test, and the scapular function test. The arch test and the hollow test can be considered two sides of the same coin. The arch test looks at the ability to maintain spinal extension and resist flexion, and the hollow test looks at the opposite, maintaining spinal flexion and resisting extension. A client needs both at the same time to brace the core effectively and create a stable spine. The squats test assesses proficiency at squatting under increasing levels of stress. If your client begins to flex their spine as the squats become more difficult, use the arch test to see if they have the coordination to resist flexion of the spine. The glute function test looks at motor faults that compromise glute contraction. Think back to those secondary questions we covered earlier. Failure to contract the glutes will destabilize the legs and make it more difficult for the core to maintain extension and resist flexion. Same again for the scapular function test. It's looking at motor faults that compromise stability of the scapula. Failure to set the scapula correctly will compromise the upper limbs and increase stress on the torso. This test provides coaches with a few kinesthetic references for other movements. How to resist spinal flexion in the deadlift and to maintain the rack position in movements like the overhead press and front squat. How to create and maintain a deliberate arch during the arch bench press. And lastly, co-contraction of the anterior and posterior core is necessary to stabilize the spine. The arch teaches contraction of the posterior core muscles, while the hollow test deals with the anterior core. To sum up, the arch test is our first active assessment, and it looks at a client's ability to maintain and generate extension of the spine. The counterpart of this test is the hollow test, which assesses the ability to maintain and generate flexion of the spine. When combined, these two skills create midline stability. Without that midline stability, the limbs will struggle to generate leverage and cause a drop in performance.